Great. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and the really kind invitation. It's really lovely to be here during obviously what is a difficult and interesting time. Thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you very much to Marta and Mateusz for the just for setting this up and for meeting me at the airport particularly as well, and just being brilliant hosts. So it's really lovely to be here. I hope you can hear me at the back. I sort of feel like this is quite a long boardroom style, so I'll try to project a bit more, but I'm reading from a script too, so let me know if I'm not very audible at the back, please. So in this presentation, I want to look at mobility in a particular way and to focus on a form of emergency mobility. We might debate whether those terms are useful or relevant here. I want to focus on the kind of emergency mobility that we might more regularly know as evacuation. I've been interested in this term for quite a long time, and several moments have been quite central to this work. And I just want to position a little bit where I'm coming from before I get into it. I guess the first time I started working on this was, during a moment which probably influenced a lot of other researchers at the same time, which was sort of witnessing the World Trade Center attacks and the collapse of the two towers, and watching that happen in a strange set of circumstance where I was working during a sort of summer job with a group of engineers, civil engineers, who were trying to understand sort of why the building failed in quite a clinical and technical way, at least in the immediacy of that moment, and distance, of course, through the television footage that we were watching. At that point in time, I was at the cusp of beginning a PhD project, interested in quite a different sort of building type or infrastructure. I was embarking on a PhD on airports, exploring the ways that airports are lived and secured, but also designed and shaped. Sometimes they're shaped by fire evacuation planning and simulation. And I suppose I was starting to kind of join the dots between such different ways of apprehending, moving in emergency. On the one hand, I was sort of within a milieu of an engineering-led understanding, not only of the Twin Towers collapse, but also of mobility in tightly constrained circumstances, almost treating the mobile body through engineering assumptions of body size, type, sometimes even as molecules, woven into physicalist and fluid simulations or agent-based models and embedded into building standards. But on the other hand, as I was beginning my PhD, I was also being immersed in a wave of thinking about mobility, often referred to in the plural mobilities, which included scholarship from migration studies, tourism, travel and transport, an approach which is sort of gradually coalesced around different kinds of terms, but mobility studies is perhaps one of them. And that takes far more culturally nuanced approach to mobility, to see mobility as politically and socially embedded and embodied. And of course of not only human movement, but also non-human mobility too. And in many ways, the evolution of my work on evacuation mobility has tried to bring some of these different kind of orientations then to movement in emergency together. So that's a little bit of, I guess, some of my personal context and orientation to this. In this paper, what I want to do is put some things into play and set up some different understandings of evacuation, which I hope is useful and interesting. I'm worried it might be a bit abstract today, and my examples are going to be a bit rambling across different parts of my work. So I don't see this as a very tightly confined empirical paper. So bear with me. But it's an attempt to try to sort of put the idea, the concept and practice of evacuation into kind of a critical perspective. Just as an aside, I really appreciate, of course, you following me in English. My writing is not always that great or that clear, but I've tried to put some of the phrases of what I'm going to say into the slides. So I hope it's a bit easier to follow as I go. So in this talk, I want to say a few things around an approach to evacuation, and particularly to try to draw thinking around evacuation in relation to aesthetics, aesthetic feeling and aesthetic judgment, and to talk about why I think they matter in relation to different kinds of emergency mobility. I want to draw on a range of different issues, sometimes around euphemism and the disguise that often accompany evacuation, to draw attention to what we might think of as quite agonistic relations and tensions that evacuation engages, and that can help us understand blame and culpability and some of the inadequate assumptions that can go into evacuation planning, different representations of evacuation, but also at the end of the paper to identify some potential that inhabits evacuation too, some political potential. I'm going to follow roughly this structure. Okay, so first part on names and concepts and practices. So some of the approach I take draws quite heavily from different approaches to genealogy, such as from Stuart Eldon, who writes on territory within quite a particular framework, to explore territory as a name or a term, as a concept, set of ideas, and a series of practices. And I want to explore evacuation in a similar way. So my wider project that I'm going to be drawing from today tries to trace the names, concepts, and practices of evacuation most broadly across the 20th century, and most primarily in English language available materials and research, but not exclusively. Moreover, it draws on Laura Stoller for what she calls a recursive analytics, in that I'm interested in using scenes and juxtapositions of evacuation to try to stay with not just the obvious, the continuities of evacuation, but also its discontinuities, dispersions, and comings together. What I mean by this is that Stoller invites quite a critical but also an unconventional genealogy of recursions, which means to follow how something like evacuation, Stoller's following other things like the colony, but to follow how evacuation is reinvented and rearticulated, recombined and dispersed, made and remade in different contexts across time and space. So I'm quite interested in paying attention to the forgotten and sometimes quite uncomfortable things that we call evacuation, or it's quite uncomfortable to call evacuation certain things. So to ask, in other words, what evacuation clings to as a notion and what places where it seems to belong and not belong. So this is not really a deliberate attempt to try to be difficult, but rather to recognise the difficulty with which evacuation subsists in relation to other political categories. Again, Stoller kind of talks about the colony as a subjacent political category in relation to other kinds of forms. And in relation to evacuation, many other subjacent concepts of movement or forced movement are often much more politically visible and deliberated. And I think it's evacuation's capacity to sort of hide in plain sight and to simultaneously enact different kinds of withdrawal from scrutiny, from sense, from clarity, from understanding, that I think makes it a really interesting and invidious thing of mobility. Okay, protection. So what is evacuation, and how might we think about evacuation as a kind of protection or a practice of protection, a logic of protection, or does it work through logics of protection? Evacuation as an act of leaving and being told or helped to leave, perhaps before, during, and in the aftermath of an emergency or a disaster. Maybe this seems straightforward enough. For Zielinski and Kaczynski, writing in the context of their monograph on urban evacuations, which I think is probably one of the only works of synthesis on the topic in a long time, to be published in English at least, evacuation for them had a difficult polymorphous character, often moving over the ground of different disciplinary contexts, transport geography, migration research, blurring neat categorisation, being a hard thing to place. Within the history of a discipline like my own, in geography, human geography, evacuations have tended to be pursued within urban and historical subdisciplinary approaches, which I'm not going to labour on. With the former seeking to remove an attentiveness to the geographies of conflict, particularly through the focus of kind of the view from above and aerial war in the context of the Second World War, which some of that research in geography was focused on. For others, like Derek Gregory, conflict again is another site of evacuation mobility, but rather he is interested in a medical military nexus, following the wounded from conflict zones. While in other more recent work, like Mimi Scheller and others, have shown in empirical studies work that demands mobility justice. And that we see a number of different researchers, probably the biggest social science sort of coordinated research around evacuation, was at least in North America, was around Hurricane Katrina. Or in other contexts, you could take the South Korean Academy's engagement with the Seawell ferry disaster. But Scheller's writing is interested in writing about the differentiated and bifurcated mobilities and immobilities experienced in the aftermath of the January 2010 earthquake in Port-au-Prince in Haiti. Evacuation as a thing is often intended to displace, to move something or someone away from something threatening in a relation sought to provide protection, and to be sure that there are wide and varied calls, demands, and rights to evacuation. Recognise this. And we can recognise too, not only that such claims are ignored and many fall outside of who gets to evacuate. We can recognise that those claims are sometimes ignored and that many can fall outside of who gets to evacuate. And we might think about those differentiations of mobility, of the capacity to move in emergency, from a politics of mobility, which is interested in power geometries of difference, so how are we unevenly positioned in relation to our capacities to move in emergency, or as Mimi Scheller has framed it most recently in mobility justice, around not only who has access to mobility or indeed mobility and who gets to benefit from it and who might not, but also within a mobility justice framing around what structural and multi-scalar forces and agencies also condition capacities to move in emergency. I'm interested in this, but I'm also interested in the underlying logics that destabilise an expectation that the relationship between evacuation and protection is clear or set in stone. In other words, I don't think it is. And we can explore how that relation is in places often reconfigured, made strange, warped and distorted. If we were to sort of even trace the idea of evacuation as a concept, sometimes evacuation is used completely outside of physical movement altogether. It's more of an almost metaphor for physical mobility. So take, for example, this is very selective quotes here, but take, for example, Allen, who utilises evacuation as a move to absolve women and femininity from the strictures and expectations of particular constructions of motherhood. But in this more distant relation, evacuation is still a conflicted thing. To evacuate, as a transitive verb, describes an act we might call of negation, of taking something away, a removal of something or a substance. Even in protection, in the case of Allen's use of the term, it's a motion to remove a burden, shackles, or particular kinds of normative understandings and forms of motherhood and motherly practices and obligations. But it still might be understood as a repulsive move. We can also understand evacuation as a more repulsive move. And what I'm interested in is this more frequently negative utilisation of the term. So, for example, for Catherine McKittrick and others, in the multiple articulations of slavery and anti-blackness, evacuation describes the removal of life from blackness by systems of counting and archiving, In this sense, evacuation becomes another kind of subtraction, an abstraction, leaving life breathless. In this sense, evacuation is once more a negative, a taking of something away, and its enunciation requires an object. But that object can often be vague and interchangeable, as I'll try to show. And in many formulations, evacuation most often means a subtraction of or from politics. So there are countless examples of where evacuation, perhaps in its more traditional meaning of moving people, or people being moved, or people moving, does not protect but harm. Where evacuation in the face of people in the face of the emergency is the emergency. And this is perhaps another side of the negativity, sometimes even nihilism, that I see around evacuation and its aesthetics. When evacuation has been modified, maybe even disguised, in order to exclude, displace, eradicate, even justified as protection, but not of the thing or the subject or the community to be moved, but rather for another ethnic group or a state or an ideology for the sake of their protection. And indeed, multiple versions of evacuation with different objects of protection can even coexist and maybe even coincide and interfere with one another. And moreover, such forms of evacuation have more in common with earlier, pre-modern, even biological, clonic senses of evacuation, which perhaps is easy to lose sight of. When evacuation means bodily abjection, or the abjection and expulsion of the body's own substances, often along highly gendered, racialised and ratio-colonial dimensions. For example, in cultural histories of menstruation and defecation show this. They show the multiple multitude of ways bodily experiences and practices of expulsion or evacuation are governed, outlawed and made taboo. And sometimes these more biological notions show up in more common sense ways of understanding evacuation too. So for John First, in a collection of British writers, novelists and poets writing about their experience of evacuation from cities to the countryside during the Second World War, First ignores the segmentation of evacuation's multiple linguistic definitions from a dictionary and tries to bring them together. It all fits: the withdrawing, the emptiness, the troops, the vacuum, above all, the vacuum. I was evacuated. I won't comment on the excrement. So I'm interested in evacuation's attractive qualities. It seems to cohere and bring things towards it, and its repulsive qualities, its capacities and conditions to expel, where evacuation forms highly political and aestheticised judgments over what belongs and what shouldn't, what should be ejected, and how one might feel as being withdrawn or emptied. Aesthetic judgments are bound up in simultaneously normative, discursive, evaluative, and affective felt moves. Indeed, it's often been claimed that narratives around evacuation draw upon an aesthetic propensity, which is to see evacuation in quite functional, technical terms, especially if we think about it from the context of the engineers and the planners that I started the talk with. But this is also a familiar critique that other academics have made. So, for example, Tim Cresswell, one of the sort of leading writers in mobilities research, has remarked a few years ago now on the denials of racism in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and its botched evacuation, the city's botched evacuation effort, not just of course, in New Orleans either, where he writes that the effect was to empty mobility of its social content, a separation of mobility from race and age and class in particular. So he sees various efforts to characterise evacuation as nothing to do with race as a common move to try to abstract mobility and its provision and planning to a technical and apolitical space. So in other words, evacuation itself might appear to be quite empty, and it can be constructed as so, while also peculiarly emptying. It might lack substance beyond quite a technical sense of process, whilst it seems able to withdraw the relations of other things and events to a technical register. So I appreciate this is a bit tautological. Evacuation seems to, in itself and in its relationship to others, to be judged as a negative act, as a conditioning property of absence. In the universalising and neutralising manoeuvres it often assumes and performs, something is removed, even feeling, and yet it is often bound up in very felt-based aesthetic evaluations, which is what I want to explore. Okay. So to explore this, I want to do so in dialogue with other writers, not only on mobility, but also on aesthetics, such as Cyan Nagai. I want to spend a little time on a project a very long way away, developed in Wellington, New Zealand, by the Wellington Region Emergency Management Organisation that followed the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. And this was a plan that was designed to develop a simple system to tell people where to evacuate to in the event of a tsunami. In 2019, I visited the lines, spoke to some officials, and embarked on a go-along driving interview to sort of track down the lines. The scheme partly draws on a development of standardised emergency evacuation signage for tsunami evacuations and other kinds of evacuations from public buildings and public spaces that follow international standards. Whoops. Oh, and this is one of the original imagery. And some of this imagery, I'll come back to the context of where this imagery came from. So this is the tsunami signage in Wellington evolves international emergency exit and evacuation signage, which was built on a pictogram that was designed within the Japanese Sign Design Association's competition in 1973 or 4 that was won by Yukio Ota. And I want to come back to that context a little bit later because it's significant. Often in an emergency, evacuation signage like this is an attempt to instruct, gesture, but also quiet and subdue heightened feelings of disaster. A way to direct and channel mobility, a way to avoid confusion and indecision, to try to mediate and tune in and out of feeling. The cool, chilling, technical affordances of evacuation governance can be pitted against fears of a volatile, hot, individual and collective physicality. Sometimes we give this name panic, that might rupture evacuation. In emergencies, urgencies, panic, calamity are common affects that are often attributed as a cause for evacuation, as well as the feelings evacuation is meant to guard against. As good examples of the complex, transversal, and non-linear characteristics that are often attributed to feeling and affective life, the attachment to panic in emergency means these feelings are often conditioned by contextual and situational unfoldings of the future and the past that play out in the present. In other words, evacuation works with a kind of remainder, a surplus or excess of the feelings it's trying to subdue, but that may also have precipitated it, especially when evacuation is conjured as a kind of flight. It's a common, at least in English, is common kind of refrain to call an evacuation escape a kind of flight. Indeed, panic, flight, to take flight often occupy descriptions of evacuation as some kind of opposition to. So a poor or not so urgent evacuation cannot be orderly is perhaps a flight, as a post-respective judgment of people fleeing. Evacuation then must prevent panic, or panic might prevent evacuation and even be the cause of it. Evacuation should be calm and orderly. Or a more negative evaluation of evacuation is not an assertive move to escape, but a more negative one again, a withdrawal or a retreat. So, for example, the Israeli disengagement of settlers from the Gush Katif settlements in Gaza were frequently described as evacuations. Yet both disengagement and evacuation were also criticised as highly neutral technical terms to describe a highly politically fraught process, and an attempt to withdraw that process from other, even more negative terms, like withdrawal, retreat, displacement, or eviction. Indeed, as Ariel Sharon once slipped about the disengagement, he said in a media interview, "I have given it an instruction to carry out the evacuation," before correcting himself, "pardon, the relocation." Indeed, by naming the disengagement in this way, evacuation became a conduit with which some, from more extreme religious perspectives, linked the settler displacements to the failed evacuation of New Orleans and the geopolitical influence of the Bush administration on the Israelis one. And some even claimed it was an evacuation for an evacuation. Back to Wellington, and the signs and public instructions use particular visual and more than visual addresses that try to provoke and prompt aesthetic sensibilities and judgments. Many of these are commonly associated with emergency mobility practices, such as exiting from a building. I'm inspired by Nagai's terms when she writes that aesthetics hail or call forth not only specific subjective capacities for feeling and acting, but also specific ways of relating to other subjects and the larger social arrangements these ways of relating presuppose. Nagai's approach might help us to consider the different sides of aesthetic categories, a side that is about judgments and the utterance that form them, but also experience, the forms that we perceive, ways of seeing. If we look at the blue lines again, they're painted directly onto the road surface, and which means that they weather and erode, and they can see them kind of cracked and a bit mottled here. They're also seen at a distance, they're glanced at, of course they're ignored, they're viewed from mobile and oblique perspectives. I tried describing these lines to my 4-year-old son. This is a sort of lesson, kind of a parental lesson on evacuation. I was describing them on a kitchen table using a blue bag, it was the only blue thing I had, and some cups to try to demonstrate. So the cups were houses, my sort of walking fingers were people escaping, and I twisted the bag into a kind of line and sort of fumbled an explanation using the kind of poor gestures I'm using right now. So I explained the line tells you where the big waves will not reach. And if you live on this side of the line and you run across the line, ta-da, you're hopefully safe. So this, I explain, is what some people call evacuation planning. My son then made quite a characteristically tangential but imaginative point. For him, he's 4 then, the sea creatures, the animals, the fish and crustaceans that might be brought onto land by the tsunami are way more interesting than the people who might get, for him, in their way, perhaps to evacuate back to the sea. And this can actually become a real problem. But what I'm interested in here, in both his, but also more unspoken intuitions and judgments of evacuation, is who or what is seen and counted. Some of the marine evacuations. In other words, political and aesthetic judgments can work with a priori and constructed delimitations of what is seen, heard, touched, or sensed. Evacuations are relations between human and non-human life, moving, mingling, and living among turbulent times. My son's thinking helped me wonder about how evacuations delimit and include certain lives and species, to the extent that the non-human lives my son wondered about and worried about are rarely figured in evacuation apparatus. And of course, moving with animals and pets and companion species has become incredibly visible in recent times. The Wellington lines rely upon, though, an arrangement of particular cues, signals and perspectives, arrangements of the sensory, in order to mediate and communicate a number of things to different sets of agents, predominantly human, pedestrians, but humans in technological ensembles, pedestrians, walkers, cyclists, cars. I told you this was going to be rambling, but I've been really interested then in plans for the evacuation of non-human life too. And my contacts have explored some of this in the United States and in wartime Britain, where animal lives reside in complex arrangements to specific valuations of life and property, and often in highly negative and even nihilistic attributions of worth, should one not be able to evacuate. And this is really interesting relations and values flowing between the human and the animal that I want to kind of unpack a bit. So designed to encourage an animal evacuation planning in the United States under the Pets Act following Hurricane Katrina, animal owners had been demonized for leaving pets behind, and indeed not leaving because there was very limited provision for their animals, especially for those who are dependent upon public transport or indeed public shelters to escape the floodwaters. So in other words, those human-animal relations and connections really mattered, and it made a difference to people's propensity to move or to leave. But the new guidance over pet evacuations sustained some of the automobility privilege that excluded so many from being able to leave in the first place, which was the assumption of private automobile access or ownership, even when Hispanic and Black Americans had much lower access to the car than white middle classes. The campaign Take Your Pets With You, quite a recent campaign, is all about packaging and containing animal companions as a domesticated family member whose place is in the car. Yet on the other hand, there are plenty of instances when the inability to evacuate altogether, whether animal or human, relegates life to one less than worth living. In this sense, the inability to evacuate becomes a negation of the value of that life to live on without evacuation and or without a relationship to human companions. So, for example, pet euthanasia has been explored at length during the Second World War in Britain, when pet owners were encouraged to cull their animals in the early stages of the war, leading to the so-called Pet Massacre of September 1939, where literally thousands of animals were killed. Government and animal charities had suggested that leaving pets to fend for themselves was inhumane, and conjured images of pets running wild, infesting cities, or succumbing, even in the animals left behind even in the animals left behind we see in New Orleans, or even in the Gaza disengagement I was talking about earlier, to a kind of moralised biological decay. Evacuation would have retained an ordered relation with their owner. To not evacuate meant the value of that animal's life was severely negated. One of the strange directions this takes can be found in similar animal euthanizations during Hurricane Katrina, which took place at Memorial Hospital. When water, food and conditions got to such an extent for those animals marooned with their owners at the hospital, which had become something of a refuge for animals brought there by hospital staff and patients, some doctors decided to euthanize the animals to put them out of their misery because they could not be evacuated safely. And this was sometimes because helicopters and boats refused to take them from the hospital with their owners. But even more disturbingly, this logic flowed into the human, as several doctors began euthanizing patients as the next step in this logic, especially those who were perceived to be too ill or too large to be evacuated to, and especially given the convoluted and difficult route patients had to take to the rooftop helicopter pad on top of the hospital car park. So in this flow of euthanizations from the animal to the human, the inability to evacuate becomes a justification to take life away from the living. So as mentioned at the beginning, across different contexts and spaces, the recursion of evacuation, or evacuation's recursions, its remaking, its reformulation in different places and contexts and times and different kinds of forms and shapes, can also demonstrate a euphemistic, misnomer-like usage when it's deliberately, sometimes accidentally, also unpredictably used in a way that silenced and sidesteps more complicated relationships with protection. And I think there is something interesting about an assumption of the substantial within evacuation, and a sort of substance that hopefully I'm showing, some of that substance is much more complex, and sometimes that substance really isn't there. Evacuation, I think, is quite a blank character as well. And we might compare evacuation to or with other kinds of aesthetic categories, such as the gimmick, or what Nagai calls the interesting. In that, while to call or say an evacuation perhaps implies many things. It might imply process, action, planning, decision-making. The saying of it may be all that it contains. To say or call an evacuation can create its own affects, its feelings of relief, but also maybe disempowerment, and also many forward and backward-looking judgments as well. It may also negate the purpose from which an evacuation has been called. So sometimes to even call an evacuation implies a cause. It implies a cause from which evacuation has been legitimated. So in some of the contexts I've been looking at, such as in Australia in relation to bushfires, it's become almost politically inexpedient to say or use the word evacuation altogether. In part because of deep-seated suspicions of not simply federal but state power and emergency response to remove people from property, their properties and ownership, but also quite gendered forms of autonomy and responsibility to stay and defend people's own homes. In fact, evacuation smells of compulsion and force suggests an extensive Royal Commission inquiry in Victoria following bushfires in 2009. Their recommendations suggested that relocation was a better word, as it avoided connotations of a managed process, involving a perception of more organised exercise than simply leaving early, quoting here from the report, but also avoiding, ironically, evacuation's connotations as urgent, an urgent emotive word, so in contradistinction to the kind of the absence and the neutrality of it, which I was suggesting earlier. If we come back to Wellington again, and we see that the blue lines came from a community consultation project. They were designed to devise the simplest way of showing where to move to safety in the event of a tsunami in the roads and neighbourhoods in the Wellington region districts. The signs were intended or seem to have become a background furniture just at the threshold of people's awareness and hopefully surfacing in significance when emergency threatens. But they're also contested, what we might say in the Guy's terms as both interesting, a euphemism for a judgment deferred, a forward reference, perhaps from feelings of the incomplete or the partial. And they're gimmicky. They were treated with a lot of suspicion by local residents too. A debate in the community followed the appearance of the lines. Some were worried about their accuracy. Would they devalue house prices? Others were confused. They didn't see the point of them. In fact, it was common sense simply as where to go. For the others, the lines pointed to a more drawn-out discussions around the risk management scenarios that underpinned the lines and comparisons with Japanese tsunami experience. The lines relied upon an understanding of one's correct orientation to them, as I've discussed, and yet unclear of which side of the line they should be on. Some residents took to social media to complain. The Emergency Management Organisation responded to those concerns by providing an explanatory diagram, an abstracted representation of the sensible thresholds and judgments coding evacuation planning. This is wrong, this is right. For some, though, this was all just silly. Whoops. In other contexts, evacuations bear a more sinister relationship with other forced movements and are associated with practices of incarceration, internment and detention, and even at its extreme, ethnic cleansing and death. Evacuation's clothing seems to me means that it's quite easy to wield. To name a process which might have nothing to do with the protection of the subject we think it's meant to benefit. Of course, the rhetorical moves around forced displacement can sometimes use evacuation as a way to call something it was not, So I think in one of the papers that Marta might have circulated earlier, where I look at evacuation in Nazi Germany and Europe, it has many double meanings. Or for some of those double meanings. Or for Japanese Americans that were incarcerated in relocation camps and centres in remote desert locations, also during the Second World War, such as in Manzanar in California, evacuation was part of another grotesque argument that incarceration, named internment, was for their own benefit, and to blur the process with one of a response to a natural disaster. And indeed, central to the movement of redress in the United States context has been a reclamation of terms such as evacuation from the Japanese-American experience, where evacuation's technicality even buried it from more sustained examination. So it wasn't even usable as a label to account for a narrative of sacrifice that some Japanese Americans might have wanted to turn to. As Paul Shinoda writes, there's no glory in being evacuated. You can't say, I'm an evacuee, veteran of the evacuation. Sorry, my slides are a bit all over the place. But one guide to the lexicon of Japanese American incarceration, I've pictured here, makes clear how evacuation then encapsulated a political struggle over the meaning of the word and the determination of the events. Their guide suggests that the use of euphemisms, such as evacuation and assembly centres, made the government action seem benign and acceptable in the context of wartime. What's more, the use of evacuation impressed the belief of being rescued from some kind of disaster, like an earthquake, imputing the natural causality that often goes hand in hand with emergency and disaster. Re-narrativizations of the Japanese-American wartime evacuation or incarceration and forced displacement have played with the multiple expulsive and aesthetic senses of evacuation in the experiences of the camp, where the repulsions of those of Japanese ancestry from the privileges of citizenship and the bodily expulsions of matter. They equate to being treated like shit, and even to the ridiculousness of the wordplay that happened. So in the novel 21st Century Manzanar by Perry Miyake, revacuation, revac, is one of a number of different wordplays used to describe and upset the revacuation or evacuation, the sequel, of Japanese Americans under a new 21st century Cold War between the United States and Japan, where Manzanar is opened again. And in one crucial and hilarious and bizarre moment in the book, the camp's own vindictive and hostile director, Lillian, contemplates the contortions of her own euphemistic language in the order to evacuate an evacuation camp, which is undergoing a riotous protest from the incarcerated. And in the scene, towards the end of the book, she's talking out loud, evacuate an evacuation centre. Lillian looks at Jenny quizzically and then smiles. No, temporarily relocate a temporary relocation centre. She walks down the hallway to prepare her next move. Okay. I'm coming towards the end now. Okay, so I'm going to bring some of this back to emergency and emergency politics. So one way to approach emergency, mobility and aesthetics, as I'm trying to do through evacuation today, and perhaps some of the examples I've given, is to work through other ways of thinking about emergency, which we might do through ways of understanding exception, where emergency comes to justify exceptional police measures, an interruption to the separation of powers, and other extreme forms of sovereignty. But also the normalisation of particular governmental and administrative power within space-times of crisis, disaster, and disruption within the everyday, so that they come to shape and define the practices of emergency planning, officials, civil contingencies, organisations, business continuity strategies, public health officials, and providers, and even individual citizens being responsibilised with some of these practices. This is a way to govern emergency as a normal function of neoliberal government, self-government. From this point of view, an aesthetic of emergency that is spectacular sets some of the political stakes for evacuation within a common exceptional frame of what Bonnie Honig has described in multiple essays on emergency politics as about the extraordinary, the ruptural, and the heroic. And perhaps these are some of the styles or some of the ways I've been trying to kind of critique evacuation I've followed so far. Yet Honig's approach to emergency politics is also to question these kinds of terms and to ask for less singular but more democratic forms of political deliberation. Honig's and Ben Anderson's approaches criticise the exceptional and sovereign encircling of emergency within state and executive or bureaucratic and elite spaces of decision-making. Of course, the spectacular aesthetics of evacuation do much more than draw evacuation into a politics of exception. They can instead conceal the chronic nature of the systematic and structural inequalities and unequal relationships of power which may give rise to emergency in the first place and that shape people's capacities to move or not in these moments. They condition a far more everyday sense of emergency and mobility propensity, of which evacuation for the global majority is a recurring event within recurrent conditions of precarity, racism and marginality. But to round together some of these thoughts, in just this last part, I want to work with an angle of evacuation and emergency politics, which works with but also against some of this, and a tendency within some of this, which is what I think is about fault and about the attribution of blame, where in evacuation, fault is distributed and often individualised. Instead, as another side of the same coin, I think there are ways that we can find and affirm more positive, collective and solidaristic forms of being which are possible and deserve attention in evacuation too. So I said we'd return to the Japanese design competition at the beginning, which was around the emergency exit sign, which was set in some international standards around evacuation and emergency exit imagery. And this followed in Japan a competition that was in part sort of leveraged to better instruct publics from devastating high-rise department fires that had really run riot from the 1930s to the 1970s. A particular event in the 1970s sparked this design competition, which was a fire at the Sunichi department store in Osaka in 1973. The fire had raged through a nightclub on the upper floors of the building. People perished, stranded on the roof, some jumped from windows, cabaret dancers in a nightclub at the top of the building were pictured clambering down fire towers or being carried by firemen. The New York Times made use of familiar, in the wider history of high-rise fires, aesthetic judgments of mobile bodies, describing mobile bodies acting badly, describing a panicky stampede, people tumbling down stairways like an avalanche. The division of and amplification of feeling, class, race and gender recur with fault and attributions of fault frequently in characterizations of bad or improper evacuations. Indeed, in the Japanese case, recurrent department store fires were widely linked to changes towards westernized female dress. Some narratives suggested that this had evolved from high-rise fires and the refusal of young women to evacuate down fire towers, ropes, and exposed fire escapes and falling into life nets from embarrassment at the exposure due to traditional Japanese dress, and it's become something of a narrativized urban myth. Yet such a strange allocation of cause and fault and fallibility is a much longer trend within evacuation movement. During the evacuation of the World Trade Center, where we started right at the beginning, some considered that bigger bodies, fat or obese bodies, might be at fault for the slower evacuation of the towers than was expected. There was a big debate around evacuation fitness. In the history of high-rise evacuations, of course, when jumping and falling might be the only option to leave a building once all means of escape have been rendered useless by fire, poor design, malpractice in that design, falling, poor, immigrant and female racialized workers from North America to Bangladesh and India have often been labelled at fault in their capacities to escape in the garment industry and others. Indeed, even the Grenfell Tower block disaster in 2017 in London saw commentaries by people seeking to allocate guilt to the building's inhabitants who followed stay put advice of emergency call centre operators and fire brigade instructions. They appeared as fault was allocated to lack common sense, not simply to leave. Our own UK's business secretary has made that point. This performs a particular kind of closure which renders evacuation as individual and singular and as apolitical. In Grenfell's case and many others, it diminishes the processes of simultaneous council neglect and the simultaneous gentrification of social housing, and condescended the social inequalities which had put poorer, multi-generational, migrant and ethnic minority people within the ordinary verticalities of tower blocks in Britain, set in the contrast of one of the most wealthy boroughs in London. Across these different contexts, then, the evacuating subject tends to be individualised as ideal, but also withdrawn from their social and political context and the production of the gendered body, for example. So in the World Trade Center, women's high heels are seen as a maladaptive practice to the risks of tall towers, just as they are on aircraft, segmenting dress from other gendered social codes and obligations, as well as taste. While the fact that people walked with each other and helped each other, some even sharing shoes, might be closer to Honig's identification of a politics of promiscuity in the giving, sharing and loss of intimate relations in emergency, how can we value excess, sharing, risk, seeking out the ability to seek out new relations, new forms of life in emergency? So I'm trying to rail against these individualizing assumptions. People evacuating the Twin Towers moved against normative assumptions of individualistic behaviour that was expressed and materialised in tightly compressed stairways that were reliant on much smaller body ideals and army drill-like behaviour to move efficiently down buildings that have really been woven into the history of fire escape and fire stair design, which in the history of the World Trade Center weighed space utility for escape against potential capital revenues from the space for building rent. It was the sociality of bodies that resisted individualised and accusatory assumptions. Oh, I'm sorry, this should be the other way around. I can't turn the screen. In earlier histories of high-rise evacuations, also in North America, more collective and solidaristic forms of evacuation in the manner of leaping from a burning building has led to thousands of female migrant workers dying in high-rise tenement factory fires. And indeed, what shapes my analysis of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire is how people moving together, jumping, holding hands, dependent upon one another, frustrated assumptions of what people should do in an emergency. Well, in that context, this became an object of blame as commentators and jurors levelled the fault at the workers for moving en masse, yet selfishly breaking the elevators and the fire escapes because they congregated on them together, and even the fire nets that were intended to catch them because so many had jumped all at once. And all of this was set within the subtext of collective bargaining for better building and fire standards in the industrial action that prefigured and that followed the Triangle Fire. In short, more horizontal movements and relational ties exceeded the workers' expected responses. Their expectation to act as individualistic and selfish, and in contrast to the already existing diagrams of evacuation guidance and the interesting yet flawed approaches which sought to identify fault post-disaster. Against this framing, I see an important way to promote and proffer an embodied, feminist, solidaristic glimpse of evacuation, which does not blame or victimise people for trying to move and evacuate together, but should try to accommodate it, not to design it out. So I realise I've run way over, so let me come to a quick conclusion. There is a politics of mobility and evacuation otherwise that might solidify here as a kind of promiscuity constituted by sororal agencies of smaller scale, generous, intimate, conspiratorial and creative acts that trouble some of the individualizing assumptions that underpin evacuation and some of the aesthetic judgments that go with it and that shape evacuation and its experience. I've tried to show that these aesthetics matter greatly for how we make sense of evacuation as a form of mobility. They matter for how it's governed, how it's portrayed, planned, utilised, wielded, experienced and lived as a name, as a concept and as a practice. So these final forms signal ways of inhabiting space which sees evacuees finding ways to live and endure an emergency, but which evacuation plans and guidelines and regulations seem to try to eliminate, cast as deviant or deviants, as a common apprehension of different and alternative evacuations that perforate these bubble-like boundaries and singular lines of evacuation's aesthetic judgments and imaginations, when they might be precisely the kinds of relation that allows people to survive these moments. And that's where I want to leave it. Thanks so much.